Hello, everyone. My name is Shakayla Alvarenga, and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mob Museum. What a crowd and what a night it will be. Thank you for coming to tonight's program, DEA Agents and the Drug Lords, the 50-Year War on Illegal Drugs. The creation of the DEA was a landmark milestone in the ongoing fight against the global scourge of drug trafficking. Born out of President Nixon's determination to tackle the pervasive issue of drug abuse and trafficking, the DEA united multiple federal agencies under one umbrella to streamline efforts and maximize impact. From its very inception, the DEA recognized that drug trafficking was not merely a domestic concern, but a pressing international issue as well. It understood that a collaborative approach was essential to combat the far-reaching network of drug cartels. Now, this vision of a joint domestic and international effort laid the foundation for a relentless pursuit of justice and a safer world. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from not only 8 retired DEA agents, but also current DEA leaders who will take us on what I'm sure will be a riveting journey through their diverse array of stories and experiences. Their firsthand accounts will shed light on the challenges they faced, the triumphs they achieved, and what is to come next. Now, just like our previous public program, if you were here before, we will structure tonight's event in 3 panels, each featuring 4 speakers. The first 2 panels will delve into the DEA's history, and the final panel will be dedicated to exploring the present and the future of drug enforcement. I'll toss it over to Mr. Jeff Schumacher.
Thank you, Shakayla. Good evening. Is everybody ready for this? You settled in? This is going to be an interesting night. Last time we did something like this, we called it a 3-act play, right? You've been through those. There won't be a curtain coming down, though, in between, so it might be a little clunky in between. You'll get to see the actors going off stage and the set being changed, but other than that, it should be pretty good. We're going to talk about specific cases and incidents in the careers of these individuals, as well as some of the bigger themes, right? The war on drugs, all of the things that go along with that. We're going to jump around in time a lot. So we'll be talking about the 80s, and then we're going to talk about the 60s, and then we're going to talk about the 90s. We're going to jump around, but we can't really be helped. But we'll try to keep everybody on track in that regard. And most interestingly, we're going to span the globe with this conversation. We have agents, former agents here, who have been stationed every place in the world. I mean, it's just amazing some of the stories you'll hear. And so we'll be discussing many of the DEA's achievements and maybe a few of their failures. There's always a couple of those, right? All the stories that our panelists tell tonight will be shorter than they could be, honestly. We can't keep you here till midnight, even though but this is going to be on the long end of a program, so buckle in, be ready. We could easily do an hour on each of these individuals and their careers. We'll be here, I think, for 2 solid hours, hopefully, if you can hang in there. So please get comfortable. And also, please, if you could, silence your cell phones. So if there's any problem there, we'd rather not interrupt the panelists as they're talking. All right, I want to introduce the folks in this first panel, and I'm going to do that very briefly. Each of these biographies could be a page and a half with the accomplishments of these individuals, but I brought it down a little bit. So on my far left, Frank Panessa joined the Bureau of Narcotics in 1968 and retired from the DEA in 1995 as the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Philadelphia Division. In between, he was a legendary undercover agent who infiltrated the American Mafia and played a key role in the famed Pizza Connection case, which we will talk about. Please welcome Frank Panessa. Next to Frank is Pete Charette. Joined the Bureau of Narcotics in 1963 and retired from the DEA in 1993. In between, he worked as an undercover agent and played an important role in the French Connection case, which we'll also talk about tonight. Please welcome Pete Charette. Patty Naughton was a police officer in Indiana before she joined the DEA in 1978. She worked undercover with outlaw motorcycle gangs and the Detroit Mafia before becoming a weapons instructor. She retired from law enforcement in 2001. Please welcome Patty Naughton. Next to me is Tony Risavuto. He was a Chicago police officer for 6 years. That was probably his toughest assignment of all, if you think about it. Before he joined the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs in 1972. He served in Chicago, Mexico, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. before retiring from the DEA in 1997. Please welcome Tony Risavuto. So I thought we would start, you should start with, the sexiest case you have, right? So let's start with Frank. And Frank, if you could kind of explain for us what the Pizza Connection case was, and then ultimately your key role in making it happen.
Is this son? Yep. You have to understand that there's two mafias. There's the Sicilian mafia and the American mafia. I infiltrated the Sicilian mafia. Okay, it was the Bonanno family. They were responsible for bringing in billions of dollars of heroin into the United States. I personally bought over $1 million worth of heroin from the Sicilian mafia. And what had happened was we had information that there were major Sicilian violators in Philadelphia that were distributing wholesale amounts of heroin. And they had 20 pizza shops as a front. And in the pizza shops, they had, I considered them slaves. These were people from Sicily who were brought to the United States to work in the pizza shops. Not only that, but to distribute the heroin and to do any hits. By hits, I mean any murders that had to be done by the mafia. What had happened was there was no way you could get into the mafia unless you were born in Sicily. We had arrested two wise guys in Philadelphia that were attached to the Bruno family. And so I said to them, you have to cooperate or you're going to go to jail for a long time. And so they said, well, we're not going to give you anybody in the Bruno family. So I said, well, how about the Sicilians? They said, oh, they're not Italians. Yeah, that's no problem. So anyway, they went to the Sicilians and said that me, Frankie Pagano, which was my undercover name, was the chief hijacker for the Bruno family, and he had just hijacked a shipment of cigarettes. We knew that the Sicilians had, remember when you used to go into restaurants and you had the cigarette machine in the vestibule, you pulled to get the cigarettes? Well, they had 80 machines in the Philadelphia area. So, you just can't go in and say you want to buy heroin. So they said to him, he has a shipment of cigarettes. Are you interested in them? And he says, of course. At that time, he was paying $7.10 a carton for cigarettes. We, as the government, went out and bought them for $7.10 a carton, and I sold them to him for $4 a carton. So now I'm somebody. I'm the hijacker. And it's interesting because he saw these two wise guys, and he knew they were made guys. And the way they were showing me respect in the restaurant, in their minds, they're men of honor, they said, he must be somebody because they're showing him all this respect. When drinks came out, they served me first. When the food came out, they served me first. So I got to selling them cigarettes. Now, you have to wait for the opportune moment before you put the hook in. You just can't go in and say, hey, I want to buy some heroin from you. So after a few months of selling them cigarettes and tomato sauce and cheese, one day, I put on, in an Italian expression, I put on mosso così. I put on a sad face. And so the Sicilian said to me, Frank, what's wrong? I says, well, I'm involved in other stuff. He says, what do you mean? I says, well, I'm involved in white powder. Well, why didn't you tell me? We control all the white powder in the United States. So he says to me, who you buying from? So thank God I was buying from a guy in the Genovese family that we hadn't arrested yet. So I says, I'm getting it from so-and-so in the Bronx. He says, he gets it from us. From now on, you buy it from us. And that's how the Pizza Connection started. My first buy was for $85,000 for the heroin. And you have to understand, that was a lot of money in those days. But if I was a major violator and I bought a kilo of heroin, let's say, me as a major violator, I would add, quinine to it and things like that and double the amount. And I would make, after I sold that kilo of heroin, I would make over $1 million profit. So it was major money. The Sicilian cell that I was involved in was bringing in $1 million a day. Think of this, $350 million a year just from heroin sales. That's how big it was. And nobody realized it. They were under the radar until we started working on them. And it ended up where we arrested them all. Even though I spent $1 million, we seized $3 million. So we were $2 million in the black, But this is how the Sicilian case started, and the infamous Pizza Connection case. And as I say, I was lucky to infiltrate the mafia. I was the first U.S. agent to infiltrate the Sicilian mafia. I'm very lucky.
And Frank, just to wrap this up, I think a lot of people think of this as a New York case, the Pizza Connection case. In fact, it was both New York and Philadelphia.
New York
correct?
and Philadelphia. You had Rudy Giuliani, who
Frank,
was
bring your mic up.
the assistant U.S. attorney. You had Rudy Giuliani, who was the assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. And we had Ed Dennis, who was the U.S. attorney in Philadelphia. So I made buys in Philadelphia and New York. And so they split the case up where we tried so many people in Philadelphia and they tried the rest. And the guy who tried the case in New York for Rudy Giuliani was Louis Freeh, who went on to become the director of the FBI. And they were very successful in putting all these people away. The people that I dealt with got 30 years in jail. Wow. But it was a major case. Just think of $1 million a day, and the money would be brought to an apartment house in Brooklyn. And a guy by the name of Rosario Dispenza lived in the apartment. And it was his job to take that $1 million and launder it. Now, in those days, they didn't have, the $10,000 rule where you had to report it. So he had a connection in one of the brokerage houses. And he would bring all that cash to the brokerage house. And the guy in the brokerage house knew that it was $1 million, but $100,000 was for him to launder the cash. So he would take the $900,000 and invest it in anything, like Mrs. Fletcher's storm door company. It didn't matter. He invested that $900,000. A month later, they would sell the stock. If it made money, good. If it didn't matter, because now you had a check for roughly $900,000 that they could send to the Caribbean to deposit. And they used the Dominican Republic. The Sicilian Mafia owned the Dominican Republic. They used it to do a lot of their money laundering there. And so over the time, being in deep cover, we picked up so much intelligence, but then it had to come to an end. Yeah. And I was sorry to see that, because I was into them so strong. They never suspected me. Once they walked away with that $85,000 on the first buy, I was in. I was their golden goose in Philadelphia. The next buy was for a kilo of heroin, and they fronted it to me. I never had have the money in advance because they figured, hey, he's somebody in the Bruno family, and we can trust him. And I was lucky because a lot of times when you're an undercover agent, you always have to be looking over your shoulder. I mean, I had to remember I existed in their life, so I had to remember everything that I said to them yesterday, the day before, a month ago, because they remembered it. I existed in their life. Frankie Pagano existed in their life. They also called me Frankie Pizza. That's another name. And that story goes, I got the name Frankie Pizza. I was doing an undercover deal in Brooklyn. And the young agent that was meeting with these mafioso, the guy's name was Alphonse Cafaro, who was in one of the New York families. He says, well, I'm going to bring my uncle in. And so Cafaro says, who's your uncle? He says, what, are you writing a book? He says, well, who's your uncle? So off the top of it, he says, Frankie Pizza. Haven't you ever heard of him? And so Cafaro didn't want to be embarrassed. So he says, yeah, okay, I know who he is, And that's how I got the name Frankie Pizza.
Thank you, Frank. That's great.
Okay.
I want to switch over to Pete here, and I have a feeling that the names of these two cases are not unrelated in the sense that the French Connection in some ways preceded the Pizza Connection. Pete, I wanted to talk a little bit about the French Connection, explain what it was and your role in it, but maybe just kick it off by talking about the classic French Connection movie and how that's similar and different from what you experienced.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here in front of you. First of all, he used to be my partner. We were in internal affairs, and we went all over the world together, and we had a blast. I worked on the French Connection, and the French Connection basically, in New York, most people will relate to the French Connection, the movie. And they think, well, that was the French Connection. It was just one investigation by the New York police, and in that role, the heroin that came to New York in a Citroën automobile, they discovered, and New York was, what's his name, Sonny Grasso and Gene Bachman, who played the roles of the two detectives of New York. They happened to observe them meeting some French guys from France, and which led to the eventual seizure of the heroin that they had brought in. One of them was a radio announcer. And as a result, the seizure was made, and close to 200 pounds of heroin. You figure that was well worth over $25 million worth. Well, that heroin eventually was stolen from the evidence room at the New York police. There was inside corruption going on, and they replaced it with flour. True story. And so as a result, this case became famous, and they made a movie out of it with Gene Hackman and Sonny Grasso, which I got to be friends with him on an interview on a TV show. And it portrayed, and the image that it portrayed, everybody thought, that's the French Connection. Well, if you remember, if you've seen the movie, the guy that waved bye-bye to Gene Hackman on the subway after that famous chase, that guy's name was Jean Géant. Jean Géant was the French Connection from France. He was in charge of all heroin production in Marseille, and as a result, he escaped and disappeared. They looked for him, they couldn't find him, and the word was he had fled to South America. So, President Nixon, the French Connection began actually in 1938. And as a result, there was a SDEC, which is the equivalent to the French CIA. SDEC guy in the military, and he was Corsican, came to Marseille, and after the war, started heroin laboratories. And Marseille became the center for 80% of the heroin that was being distributed in the United States. So as a result, the Corsican mob became active, and this guy was from Corsica, and the French Connection people that produced all the heroin, 80% of it for the United States, were mostly 95% Corsican. President Nixon declared war on the French Connection because of the epidemic that occurred in the United States for heroin addiction. I was a young detective in Fort Lauderdale working undercover in the 60s after I left the US Army, and I was selected as Military Police Officer of the Year in the US Army, and next thing you know, I got hired by the Sheriff's Department in Fort Lauderdale. Well, in those days in Fort Lauderdale, they only had, each shift, they had 5 deputies on each shift. But the sheriff hired me, and 8 months later, I was promoted to a detective and went into vice and narcotics. And how I became a narcotics agent, undercover agent, was because of one individual who I happened to come upon while I was doing a patrol in a black district in front of a bar, that the strip joint, and there was this gentleman laying in the gutter. It was raining like crazy. And I said to myself, this guy's gonna get run over. And I turned on my blue light. And as a result, long story short, the bouncers yelled out at me, he's a drunk, and he had a bottle of Seagram in his hand and laying in the gutter. And I walked up to him and gave him a slight kick. And he didn't respond, so I started to grab him. As I leaned down, he whispered to me, "Get away from me, I'm a cop." And I said, my response was immediate. You know what, you're not worth it. I'm getting wet. I don't care if somebody runs you over, and I took off. That caused me to become a narcotics detective. And believe it or not, he met me at the motor pool that night, and he said, "Kid," because he said, first of all, he says, "How old are you?" And I says, "I'm 21 years of age. I just got out of the Army." He says, "You look like you're 18 years old, for crying out loud." And so he says, "You reacted the way that I'd never expected, and you saved me that night." And I arrested 2 heroin traffickers that night. And he says, "You're gonna be hearing from me." And in those days, we only had 2 narcotics agents in the Sheriff's Department in Florida, of all places. So long story short, that led me to become a narcotic agent, and I was moved to the narcotics division. There was only 3 of us, and I started making cases all over Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, Miami, and the Federal Narcotics Bureau, the original Bureau of Narcotics, which is now DEA. They used to call me and say, "Frenchie," there was only 7 agents in Miami in those days. Now there's probably close to 3,000. And they said, "We need you to work undercover for us because we're pretty well known in the community around here." And I did a lot of undercover work for the Federal Bureau. And then eventually how I got into be hired by DEA, I made numerous cases, historical cases all over Florida, undercover. And I was in school getting my police degree, and I get a phone call to go meet the director in Miami immediately of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. I went there, and quickly I'll say, he said to me, keep your mouth shut, call Washington, told his secretary, get Washington on the line, and says, I got him here, he will accept the job, but he will only take a grade 9, which in those days federal agents were hired as a grade 5, some of you know. And they called back, and Mr. Tyson hung up the phone, and he says, Frenchie, I'm swearing you in tomorrow. You've been hired as a grade 9, and you are now going to France. And I said, which was unheard of in DEA or any our agency, even nowadays. And he said, President Nixon declared the war on heroin, and they're supplying 88% of their heroin to the United States, and they need a fluent, not State Department French agent. And you are it, because I was born in Canada, spoke French fluently all my life. And so as a result, I was flabbergasted and honored, and I ended up in France. In those days, France was the main supplier, I would say, 95%. And they were, the French police was as corrupted as you could get. And the Narcotics Bureau was corrupted. And then we had a director in France who oversaw all of our European office in Europe. And he had a press conference without authorization from, and never sought permission from Washington. And he held a press conference with the French newspaper and the TV people, and accused the French of being in cahoots with the Corsican mob supplying heroin to the United States. Well, the president of France gave him 24 hours to get out of France. True story. And he became a good friend of mine. And as a result, they dismantled the entire Narcotics Bureau and made the director of the robbery squad the head of the Narcotics Bureau, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Lowell. He became like a father to me after I got to France, and he brought his own guys in. Relationship was not that good in those days because of the corrupted officials, etc. So they said, you're going to France, you're going to work undercover for the French police, posing as a Canadian mobster. Quite an honor, and I said, okay, and they said, you go through the academy, and next thing you know, 3 months later, I was in France, and I was introduced to Mr. Lemuel and his guys, brand new guys, and my first case, I was working undercover for them, because under the Napoleon Code of Law, French police are not allowed to work undercover because they called it entrapment. So they said, Pierre, you're going to be the undercover guy for France police. And I started, and my first case, which I'm going to keep it short.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you can just talk about a little bit about being undercover and then kind of wrap up what happened with the French Connection.
Okay. I did work undercover. My first undercover case was the first case that really surprised me. And they said, we have someone that is selling opium, raw opium, 15 kilos of it. And it was worth around $375,000. And you're going to be introduced to this guy, the guy that wants to sell it. And so I said, big one? Oh, and I said, I picked the location where he will deliver, and so it was on the Champs-Élysées where there was a lot of people. Long story short on that one is that basically I met him and all that. He finally showed me the opium, had a car pull up right in front of the Claridge Hotel, and next thing you know, he opens the trunk, and I see the opium, and I was wearing like a French beret. I look really good, though, really, honest to God. And so I took off the beret to scratch my head. It wasn't bald at that time. And as a result, that was a signal to come on in. The merchandise is here for the cops to come in with our agents who were doing surveillance also. And I just want you to know, everything I ever done, it wasn't Pete Charette. This was a team effort. It's not I. It was we did this together. And I always gave credit to everybody because I don't believe that you can't just do any of this without a team. And my ex-partner knows what I'm talking about. So when they came in, sirens were blaring, and I turned to this Corsican guy, and I said, "You SOB, you set me up. You're gonna die." And I took off running. I ran through the Claridge Hotel, and of course they were arresting everybody that was involved. And I always had an exit. As an undercover people, you have to find your exit in case something breaks loose. And I ran through the hotel, and as I was going out through the back door, through the back street, I hear this voice, "Arrêtez, arrêtez, police, police." And I'm saying to myself, what in the devil is this? And so then I turned and started running, and I was in good shape. I was 35 years of age. Well, that day I broke the Olympic record for, because when this police officer came out of the Claridge Hotel and I'm running, I'm about 40 yards away, pow! He shot at me. Thank God he hit the building. I put it into high gear. That's when I broke the record. And I hid in a bar for 3 hours, and sirens were blaring all over the place, and finally everything came down. I went to the police station, and I asked Mr. Lamel, I said, something happened. Why was this police officer shooting at me? And that's the danger you have to take working undercover, folks. And he said, well, Pierre, to be very honest, we didn't tell the uniformed people that you were an undercover agent. I said, I think we're going to change the policy.
Thank you, Pete. I think we're going to, thank you very much. That's really good. As you can see, DEA work involves a lot of undercover work, and we're going to jump into this now with Patty as well. Patty was undercover in a variety of different fields. Outlaw motorcycle gangs was, I think, one of your specialties. Do you want to talk about your experiences undercover?
I suppose you're wondering how in the hell that happened. Yeah. First of all, I started, after graduating from Indiana University, I started, I'll be brief with that, with the Bloomington Police Department, which is where IU is. And I am proud, and I think it was an accident, honestly, that I was elected the first female class president in the state of Indiana's police academy. And the only thing I can figure out, thank you. Thank you. I think, honestly, what happened is, you had to make a little speech, and I tend to be pretty verbose, and I think a few people had sympathy and voted for me. I mean, it was really, I still don't figure it out, but I am really proud of that. And then as a police officer, I was moonlighting in narcotics in 74, and the state, in Indiana, the state police is the premier law enforcement agency. And they didn't even have female troopers until 1976. So they came down, and when I tell this story, people in law enforcement laugh, because this is what happens to the undercovers. They came down and gave my department a whole bunch of money and cool cars and all this cool tech stuff. And in return, I got shipped all over the state, going in to these low-level drug dens and all that kind of stuff, making buys when they couldn't get a woman in. And then in 1978, I consider it an honor, a very big honor. I was recruited by DEA, And I became one of the very first women when I was with DEA, when I came on the force in '78. I was a 1%er. We were 1% of the DEA agent force, which was 2,500. And I was in Detroit, and at the time, the chemicals were everywhere. I was on one of 4 clandestine lab groups. The bikers were cooking like crazy. There was a pipeline between Canada and Detroit and into the Midwest, and it was just prolific. And a lot of that, PCP was a huge drug problem, acid, which you don't hear much about now, crank, all of these things were just cooking like crazy, and all of these different gangs were just prolific. I think the one that you're most interested in was probably the one where I was undercover. And I didn't just, I was supposed to cover 3 states, but I got shipped all over because there were so few females to work undercover. Was one where I was undercover on both the Outlaws motorcycle gang, which, as you know, is one of the 1%ers, and also the Grim Reapers. And my first undercover meeting was in Louisville, Kentucky, and my first undercover buy was with the newly appointed chapter president of the Louisville Outlaws and the past national president of the Grim Reapers. And I met them in a bar that was owned by the Grim Reapers past president, Fred Adams, and I was in that bar. It was a clubhouse bar, basically. I was the only woman in there. My surveillance was across, I think it was a 6-lane highway. I had no gun, no badge, and no wire. Because anybody that's ever investigated or worked undercover on biker gangs or knows anything about it, is they infiltrate the law enforcement and the court entities. They try and get as many people and as many relationships, oftentimes it's their girlfriends, with people that work in these law enforcement professions or court systems, as it's their intelligence operation. That's how they find out what's going on. And from the very beginning, I was warned that I would get tossed, and I did. So I was completely alone. And then later what I did is I actually brought in a male undercover, because my story was always that I was traveling from Virginia for my old man. And then I brought in actually a very, very accomplished DEA agent who had worked a lot of gangs, and I brought him in on the case. And it was nice for me knowing that I was going to be here, because I touched base with him after all these years, and he had a lot of statistics on it. We actually did go down into Florida, into Jacksonville. We met the regional chapter president, and we went down in. That's how far the case went, down into there. And he had the stats, 56 arrests off of that. It was a meth case. So that was an important case. But I also worked on a lot of other biker gangs. The one thing I want to share, I'll be brief, is that when I told you about the intel, we had to meet with the regional chapter president of the Outlaws in Louisville, Kentucky, and we had an undercover car. This is after I brought him in, and it was a big old white Cadillac. You know, we had all these seized cars. And we were driving up the road after the meet, and we had a radio secreted, so we turned it on. And surveillance starts freaking out because everybody knows what a probie is. It's a probationary biker, and they have them do all sorts of stuff. And they will do anything because they want to become a full-fledged member. The guy is driving, and I quote, like a bat out of hell. The agents are really excited and worried to catch up with us, because what he was going to do was catch up with us and cause a wreck. So the police would come and we would be identified, and that way it would go to this one Pacific police officer they had on the payroll, and they could check our bona fides to see if we were in fact DEA agents or whatever. And in fact, I must tell you, that is one of the creepiest, scariest, most awful feelings I've ever had, knowing that I'm going to be in a car accident. Am I going to be hurt? And that did, in fact, happen. I didn't get hurt. We didn't get hurt. But that did, in fact, happen. That's how good those people are.
Patty, briefly, if you could talk about the 1983 shootout you were involved with, and then your involvement with the trauma team after that.
Sure. In 1983, I was the first woman to shoot somebody in the line of duty. Not proud of it, had to be done. You know, our goal is not to kill, our goal is to stop the threat, and I stopped the threat. And as a follow-up, DEA in 1986 was formulating a national trauma team. DEA was recognizing, I have to say, I am so proud of DEA. DEA, I still feel, takes the biggest risk. It's the most dangerous. It's the most day in, day out, dramatic, dangerous of all of the agencies, hands down. And DEA was recognizing, because there were so many people, so many shootings, kidnappings, agent kidnappings, hostage taking, all sorts of problems. Agents were committing suicides. People were having shootings and not able to recover. They said, we have to do something. So I was pulled in along with other agents throughout the country that had been in shooting situations, and sat on a panel and worked with the formulation committee. It was, what do we need? This is what we need. How does it feel? What is it like? What is the effect? And so I still feel that I'm so honored that they asked me to participate in this, and I became one of the founding members. And our goal was to go out in the field in any critical incident, take over, work with the agents involved, treat not just the shooter, not just the person who's taken hostage, but the whole team. DEA is very, very much a crew. As Pete said, we don't do anything alone. And when there is a trauma, the whole crew is traumatized. It's very much like a military mission type situation. There's all sorts of guilt, there's fear, and then a lot of these circumstances that then as a responder that I saw where the whole crew had to be treated after a critical incident. And that model was picked up by many, many other agencies after it was started with DEA. And I'm very proud of the work that DEA has done, and that other agencies are really picking up the. I recently am doing research on it and want to do some writing on it. And this is an old stat, but I saw something I was reading today that in 1994, the stat quoted that 70% of police officers involved in shootings left the job within 7 years. That's because they weren't getting the help they needed. And I want to put that out for all of you, that when police officers go through this stuff, we hurt. You know, we have the toughness, but we do hurt.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's amazing how time flies. We're on the verge of wrapping up this first section. Tony, you were involved in the DEA for many, many years, involved in a lot of different cases in different places. I thought we might talk about one of the bigger ones you were involved in, which was Operation Padrino, and kind of how that all started and what it led to.
Yeah, I was assigned over to Mazatlan, Mexico, and I'd just gotten there. And we were, first day there, as a matter of fact, my boss says, hey, we got to go over to Culiacan. And at that time, Culiacan was the drug center of all the cowboys, all the really tough guys. So we went in there, and I didn't know what he had in mind, but what he did was he pulled out what they called a DFS badge and said, this is Pedro Avilas to the Comandante, so we know where he is. And the Comandante looked at him and said, get out of town right now with that guy with you. Get out of here, stay out. We'll tell you when to come back. We found out later on, I got a call in the morning from the embassy and said, get everybody, get together, stay away from Culiacan, don't go back there, because they just killed 16 people. And the 16 people that they killed was, of course, Pedro Alvarez. And that started the whole thing. We were trying to figure out what had happened. Well, They claimed it was a big ambush, that one of their agents got shot, and we had to do everybody, including two female girls. So I got a little carried away with this and found some pictures that was given to me by a little money there that I had to go into the hospital, and found the 16 people that were all shot with small holes this way, big holes out that way. They just totally killed everybody right there. So we started looking at this group, and after a while, you get really sensitive. You're doing work over there, you're collecting information, a lot of intelligence work, trying to figure out who's who are the big guys, who are the bad guys. And this happened for about 2 years, and had quite a collection of people. So I got transferred to Los Angeles. And when I got transferred to LA, I found out that there was this guy living over there called Francisco Aviles, who was Pedro's brother, and he was a big heroin dealer. So we started working on him. And as we worked on him with the LAPD, which were just incredible guys to work with, we were really taking off quite a bit of heroin. We were looking at things, doing some undercover work, trying to figure out who's who. And I was getting these strange calls. And they would say, hey, this guy Ernesto Fonseca is staying in a little hotel over here. He's sick, but watch him. And so we go to the hotel. We just missed him. I knew who he was. He was a really big guy. He was the padrino. And, you think you really got something going. So as this case enveloped, it really became strange. We're looking at all these people. I did a wiretap on them, trying to figure out who's who and where the groups were in Los Angeles, and we were pretty successful. We ended up arresting quite a bit of them, including Aviles, and he got about 20-some years, I think, on that case. And it was about 20 arrests. But we kept on going and kept on finding things. And all of a sudden, we had a case going in Madrid, Spain. The people from the Aviles case had gone to Madrid. And we didn't know this, but Madrid had a really good crew of narcotic investigators. And what they did was they were wiretapping this guy that who was this guy? He was a BMW dealership in Madrid. He had a lot of money, and his name was Juan Mata Ballesteros. And Juan Mata Ballesteros is talking to this guy in Mexico. And this guy in Mexico was Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, which we had identified before. And if you've seen the Narcos and all that, you know who these people are. And he'll tell you a little bit more about that one later on. But, we started looking, and we found out, they said, hey, Fonseca owes us money for 85 kilos of coke. He hasn't paid. And they said, kill him. Which never would happen, because this guy was at one time the padrino. They let him off. But that's when we started really looking at this Felix Gallardo, seeing what's going on. So we went from there into another operation. And I was in the States getting some calls again from I don't know who, but somebody would call me every once in a while and say, go here, go there. And so we started looking more and more. We started seeing this group that had these Colombians at the time, not really from Mexican out, but the Colombians were doing all the bidding. And they were in cells all over the city. And we were starting to look at that. And as we went through, again, we started saying, wow. So we watched them, did surveillances, did everything we can, trying to get into their operation, which we couldn't because they were so tight. But we continued on, and we did $400,000 one day, $400 million, $4 million out of a hotel. And that was the first big money seizure of DEA out of a hotel and not a bank or anything else. So, lo and behold, the banker for Felix Gallardo was there with his wife. And he allowed me, after I talked to him very nicely, to go into their house. And into the apartment that they were running in a hotel, we saw these bags just full of money sitting there. So, of course, we decided, well, this is going to be a nice case going. So then we found out there was another place in the hotel that had another guy in there, but he wouldn't let us go out We had to get a search warrant for him, and that took us to about 5 o'clock in the morning. We went there and got another $2 million. So we got a $4 million load on that one. And we started looking at this. So all of a sudden, we start seizing more and more and more money. And it just came up that it all was going back to Mexico. And try to develop informants, which, of course, is our main thing, is to get an informant to get into these groups that we may not be able to get into. And we just couldn't do it, but we kept on seizing their money. Then we started getting cocaine delivered. And the cocaine all had this golden, they called it the golden llama. It was a picture of a llama that was, and if you start understanding how the cartels worked in Colombia and bringing drugs in, they would mark their bags, kilo brick bags, and that's what it was a golden llama. And that came back to Mata Ballesteros again. So these people were, really becoming in charge. And Mata Ballesteros was quite a drug dealer. He was a Honduran. His wife was a drug dealer also, we found out later on, and she used to come up to the States quite a bit. We start following these people. He never did come up to the States because he was wanted, actually, out of Florida on a case. A small case that they got 95 kilos off him, and he was wanted. So we just continued with that. And as we gained more and more information, we ended up seizing probably about, I think it was over $50 million from this organization. And that was a drop in the bank. And
Thank you, Tony. I think we probably stop there. I think what's interesting about these stories is they all start with something small, right? You get some kind of a lead, you talk to somebody, you meet somebody, and then you come to find out it's some massive thing, right? And I think that's almost the story we've heard from each person on this stage. Well, this is the end of our first group. I want to thank everybody, and we're going to make the transition. So if you guys want to head out, if you could set the mics on your chairs, and we'll bring the next group in. Thank you. When we bring the next group up, we'll get started right away. So be ready for that. Yeah, it is. All right. I know we have a little transition going on in the audience, but if you could please keep it down. We're going to get started with the second act of our evening. I want to introduce the panel that we have now. On my far left is Javier Pena. Started his career as a sheriff's deputy in Laredo, Texas, before joining the DEA in 1984. He was deeply involved in taking down drug lord Pablo Escobar in Colombia, and then he retired in 2013. So that's a very quick summary. If you don't recognize Javier, you might recognize his alter ego, the man who played him on TV, Pedro Pascal, who is probably the hottest actor in Hollywood right now. So.
But I think I'm better looking, aren't I? Thank you.
And I think you're one of the reasons he's popular. So thank you, Javier. Lou Rice joined the DEA in 1974 and retired in 2000. In between, he had more than his share of excitement while assigned to a number of different DEA offices. One episode we will discuss involved the New York drug kingpin Frank Lucas, famously played, another movie reference, famously played by Denzel Washington in the movie American Gangster, which I'm sure everybody's seen. Please welcome Lou Rice. Jim Conklin joined the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs in 1971 and retired from the DEA in 1997. In between, he was stationed in San Diego, Washington, D.C., and Bangkok, Thailand, where he helped put a big dent in the heroin and marijuana trafficking to the United States, and we'll talk about that. Please welcome Jim Conklin. And next to me, immediately to my left, is Doug Wankel. His drug enforcement career spanned two periods, 1970 to 1996 and 2003 to 2007. He started as a regular agent in Detroit, then served in Afghanistan and Washington, D.C., where he retired as the agency's director of operations. He returned to the agency in 2003 and returned to Afghanistan after the United States entered the country following 9/11. Please welcome Doug Wankel. So I think we'll start with Javier, and I think it goes without saying we should talk about Colombia. I think there's a couple things I want to talk about, but if you could kind of summarize how you ended up in Colombia and what your role was in that case.
Yes, our role was to help out the Colombian National Police in the search for Kingpin Pablo Escobar. And we really didn't know that much about Escobar because I get to Colombia in 1988. Matter of fact, my chief of operations, Mr. Wankel, was in charge, so he was directing a lot. And but it was for us, for me, because I came from Austin, Texas, where I was working small time, undercover buys, heroin, crank. As we mentioned, crank was being produced a lot there. So when we started working on Pablo Escobar, we noticed that this guy had an empire, had sicarios. You know, in Austin, Texas, I did not know what a sicario was, an assassin. And he had about 500 sicarios working for him. In real brief, just one, when we arrested one of them confessed, and that made it clear to me. You know, he told me, we love Pablo Escobar. I will die and I will kill for Pablo Escobar. I was poor. He gave us money. He gave me and my mom money for a house. He said, I owe my life. And by the way, I've already killed, when Escobar started the war in Colombia, 10 police officers, when Escobar put bounties on police officers, $100 a head. So it is something that I'll never forget. We saw the rise of terrorism. We saw the Avianca airline bombing. We saw the killing of a presidential candidate. We saw the bombing of the DOS building. I mean, it was like, what was this guy doing? So again, helping the Colombian National Police, and we were there as liaison, but you know, we got involved in doing a lot of other things besides liaison. But like I said, the credit goes to the Colombian National Police, and I always appreciate. In fact, Mr. Wankel, you showed up, right? As soon as Pablo Escobar escaped, you and Bobby Nieves, I remember, took you out to the, and it wasn't a prison. I wish I could talk to y'all. It was a country club setting. But that was my experience in Colombia, going after the first narco-terrorism, Pablo Escobar, and he killed about 50,000 innocent people. So again, the credit goes to the Colombian National Police. They were the real heroes in all of this.
Javier, there's no doubt true. But what role did you and your partner, Steve Murphy, play in this whole saga?
Yeah, Steve and I, we partnered up about 1991 after Pablo Escobar escaped from prison. Then we were invited by the Colombian national government, by the Colombian National Police, had never happened, to live with them, work with them. Wow, and Tony, I wish we could have done that in Mexico, but they actually invited us, wanted us to, we lived with them for 18 months in the search for Escobar. And like I tell people, we broke policies, rules, we never broke the law. We went out with them, and it was just, by being there, that exchange of information, that exchange of intelligence, I tell people, we were doing raids in New York, in Miami, in Colombia. It was a beautiful, like I said, it was the start of remember the TKO program? We were knocking them down in both sides, and that's what really helped in going after them. And that exchange of information, which I wish was happening now in more countries, which is not, but that exchange of timely information was a big factor in taking down Pablo Escobar.
Is it true, Javier, that you have not watched the show, Narcos?
That is true. I haven't watched it, yeah. Yeah.
I think the reason I ask is I know you haven't watched it, but there are a couple things that happen, your character does in that show that you didn't do.
And you know what? I'm going to be honest. If you've seen the show, They had me like womanizing and all that. You know, I'm gonna be honest, I was ordered by the United States government to do, yeah, so it did happen. Believe me, I wish that was true. That's movie stuff, ladies and gentlemen. So that's movie stuff.
You know, and rather than just going in order, Doug, can you comment a little bit about this operation?
Yeah, let me just tell you the truth now. I never gave Javier any orders like that at all. Javier and Steve Murphy were critical to the operation to take down Pablo Escobar. And I owe them a great deal of gratitude because for my 48th birthday was the day they killed Pablo Escobar, okay? December 2nd, 1993. So I owe them both a deal on that. And Pablo was just as he described him. He's given credit, if that's the right word to use, for killing, paying for and killing some 3,000 police officers in Colombia, okay, amongst the people that were killed during his reign of terror and stuff like that. So they did a great job on this, and it's a great credit to them and to the Colombian National Police. And also at that time, we had a lot of support from the intelligence community, from the military, U.S. military, and stuff like that. So it was a really collaborative effort, but if it weren't for the 2-point guys, Murphy and Pena, on the ground there, he might have still been operating, okay?
Absolutely. Javier, I want to, this is one of those time jumps. I want to go back to 1985, and you know, in the makeup of our panel, we have, you know, nine panelists. We don't have like the perfect panelists to talk about Kiki Camarena, but Javier, in 1985, after Kiki Camarena, the DEA agent, was kidnapped, tortured, and killed, the DEA made it an express point to go find his killers. And you played a role in that. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, real quick, and this is personal. I was a brand new agent. I think I had been on the job 6 months, and Tony, you briefly talked about it. The killing of our agent, Enrique Quique Camarena, DEA will never forget, and I am glad, in fact, how DEA responded to that. But I was sent to help in the search. Brand new agent, didn't even have a passport. My boss, I speak Spanish, says, Javier, we think we've lost one of our agents. So I show up to Mazatlan, and I partnered up with John Brown, who later on became our assistant administrator, right? So I learned a lot from John, but, you know, again, it was seeing how that Mexican cartel worked and what they did to our agent, torture him, killed him. They had a doctor who would pump him full of adrenaline that would not let him die. Now that is pathetic. And I'm glad that DEA responded the way we did. In fact, I think it was President Reagan who closed the border because the Mexicans were not cooperating. Was it Reagan?
Actually, there's a story there. Go ahead.
Actually, it was the Commissioner of Customs, Willie Von Raab, that closed the border, and any kids in here? And really pissed off the U.S. government at the highest level, saying, what the hell are you doing? Because they shut down the border. No vehicles could come across either direction, commercial. No people could come across to do whatever. Forget the smugglers. I'm talking about the people going through the legitimate border crossing. And this guy, Von Raab, just shut it down because the Mexicans weren't doing what they needed to do to help solve this murder and torture of Camarena, and that brought them to their senses. But it was a pretty interesting deal that this guy did. So.
Yes, yeah, and I remember that. But I learned a lot as a new agent, but the way they treated our agent should never have happened, and I'm glad. And I just got to say, and Tony, and you were right, you know what? We followed Nancy Mata Ballesteros in Medellin going to meet Pablo Escobar. So they were tied in with that. But Rafael Caro Quintero, the guy who orchestrated the killing of our agent, is still in Mexico and has not been extradited. That is a shame. That is a shame.
And if I have the history right, he was captured, and then they had him in prison. He got out, and he was just captured again. Was it last year or the year before?
Right.
So,
and you're right. Yep, he was captured. He got out. They bribed the judge, but you know he's still in Mexico. And you know what? Pablo Escobar, I gotta say, his fight was on extradition, and his letterhead when they did the bombs, he would throw them at the bomb sites, and it said, "I prefer a tomb in Colombia than a jail cell in the United States. What does that say? All these traffickers all over the world, what's the only thing they fear? Come in here to the U.S. Anyway, so.
And, you know, one of the ironies of that is he would go on vacation to the United States.
Yeah, he'd be visiting the White House.
Lou Rice, exemplary career, so many things you're involved in. I want to see if you could tell this story, though, from 1982 in New York, where this is when you're pretty young, I think, agent, and you were off duty, though. But tell us about that story. What happened?
All right, first I'd like to just say thank you for putting this panel together and celebrating DEA's 50 years. And I think, yeah. And I think, if anything, the audience has a glimpse that DEA is a global investigative agency with very dedicated and committed men and women that go out each and every day, risk their lives trying to protect the American public.
Amen. Very good.
And when you think about DEA, I think you got to think about when it was formed 50 years ago in 1973, what was going on in the country. A little bit of context. We had an unpopular war in Vietnam. African Americans were struggling for civil rights and employment, housing, and education. We had the Watergate burglary, which caused a lack of confidence in government, and we had a major heroin problem in the United States. And DEA was formed to go after the major heroin dealers. And I, spent my time in New York City the first 8 years. My dad was a Harlem detective, proud Harlem detective, walked with that swagger, and I adored my dad. And even though I adored my dad, I didn't really want to go into law enforcement. I wanted to go into something that was going to help people like probation and parole. But a lot of my friends had went to Vietnam, and they came back. They were drug addicts. They were addicted to drugs. And these were guys that wanted to go out to parties, hang out with the girls, have a good time. And they wanted to do that when they came from Vietnam, but they wanted to get heroin first. And slowly but surely, they either overdosed or lived unfulfilled lives, and their parents were destroyed. And so when I met a DEA agent at a career day in college, I said, that's the job I want, because I can identify what those men and women are doing, and I'm going to go and get those guys that destroyed my friends. And I spent a lot of time working undercover in New York City during those days, up in Harlem, Brooklyn, the Lower East Side. And I had an unfortunate situation in Brooklyn, New York, where I was coming home one night, and the guys tried to jump me, and they did jump me. The guys robbed me, took my money, grabbed my chain, and in my head, because I had my gun with me, I figured, well, it's 5 guys, they're gonna take everything I have, and they're gonna run away, and I'm gonna chase the last guy and get him, because I was 30 years old and in pretty good shape. And they started to approach me a little bit more aggressively, and a guy grabbed my pocket, and I knew he was gonna feel a gun on my waist, and we started fighting. And I was backing up, trying to get some leverage to get the gun, and he was coming towards me. I fell down the cobblestones in New York City. If you've ever been in New York City, in the streets in Brooklyn, I fell down. He fell on top of me, and at the corner of my eyes, I saw the other 4 guys run away, and I saw one guy come back. And when I saw the one guy come back, I knew either that guy had a gun or a knife and was gonna get me, and so I had to think quick, and I started firing the weapon and winded up killing that guy. And what Patty said before, nothing I was proud about, didn't go to work that day saying I was gonna kill somebody, and it just rocked me that you take somebody's life and how everything happened so fast. And all that night I was just playing back how my life could have ended in a second, and it wasn't a drug deal with DEA. It was being on the streets of New York City in the early 80s when it was out of control in terms of crime and criminal issues.
And one of the things one little fast fact about that was, you did shoot and kill your assailant. You also shot yourself in the thigh, is that right?
Well, I don't know if I shot myself in the thigh, but we were wrestling for the gun, and I can tell you, as we're wrestling for the gun, There was a guy in a station wagon parked at the light, and I knew where the police station was. I ran to the car, and I said, "Hey, you know, I need to get in the car. Could you move over?" And the guy said, "No brakes, no brakes." I said, "That's all right." And I went to the police station, and the police, you know, as you can imagine, in the middle of the night, guy coming in, I had a wound on my leg, bleeding, gun in my hand. It's in the middle of the night, and they wanted to make sure they got the gun from me. And I said, "Hey, these guys are still out there. Let's go get them." And they said, "No, we got to get you to the hospital." So we went to the hospital, and they were bringing in guys that they thought may have been involved in this all night through the investigation to the NYPD. And, you know, I couldn't identify these guys, you know, and I wasn't going to, you know, leap and identify somebody I really couldn't identify with. But it was one of the most scariest days of my life, and fortunately I was victorious behind it, you know. And I attribute that to the training that I received with DEA, the undercover work that I did with DEA, and the planning that goes into those undercover situations where you're not second guess, but if this happens, you're going to do that. If that happens, you're going to do that. Kind of thinking how you're going to counter in an undercover operation where everything is happening live. I attribute my success to that.
Patty mentioned earlier about there being, at least at that time, you know, only a small number of women in the DEA, and I believe it's also true there was a pretty small number of black agents. Were you sought after in that way, and how did that end up growing?
So good question, Jeff. So again, if you think about when DEA was formed in the 1970s, it was the mafia, as Frank and Pete talked about, bringing heroin into the United States, and the distribution were in your major cities: New York, Atlanta, Chicago, D.C., Philadelphia, and those were the major areas where African Americans were leading the drug charge. And so the agency was looking for African Americans to bring in to work primarily undercover. Matter of fact, when I started in New York in '74, there were probably 25 black agents from around the country that were headquartered in New York, going throughout the 5 boroughs, buying drugs from major Harlem drug dealers. And so African American agents were needed to work undercover, to penetrate these organizations, and to, you know, sort of bring down the violence in the street so people could relax and live. And, you know, it was an exciting time, you know, dangerous time, not like TV where you have a take, because when you're thinking about undercover work, you're on somebody else's territory, okay? And when you're on somebody else's territory, you don't control, if you're in a restaurant, who comes in that restaurant. If you're in somebody's house, who comes in that house. You don't control that. And so you really have to be confident and a little bit lucky to get in and to get out without being hurt, you know.
I want to ask you about Frank Lucas. You had a very interesting role in his sort of post-criminal career, if you will. Can you explain that?
Sure. So if anybody, well, Frank Lucas, for those that didn't know him, they know him now through American Gangster, the 2007 movie where Denzel Washington played Frank Lucas. And who would have thought 30 years prior to that, in the 1970s, I spent about 1.5 years with Frank Lucas preparing him to testify in federal court. And it was sort of getting a PhD in narcotics enforcement, just spending time with him, listening to him, you know, how he did his business. Bumpy Johnson is legendary, known as the first African-American gangster in Harlem, and that's who started Frank in the business. The relationship may not have been as tight as Frank when he was alive would tell little stories, but Frank definitely had a strong relationship with Bumpy Johnson. And Frank, as the leader, was very charismatic. He's the kind of guy, if he was here today on the panel, he could tell a funny story to have people laughing. Shrewd businessman, knew that he had been sentenced to 40 years by the Southern District of New York, 30 years by the state of New Jersey to be run consecutively, which meant he had to do the 40 years first in New York, then go to the state of New Jersey and do 30 years, and then he had a murder case in the Special Narcotics Court. And he quickly made a decision that he didn't want to do 30, 70 years, and the way out was to cooperate, you know. And you don't really I don't like to talk about cooperation because it's a sensitive topic, because law enforcement is very successful because you got men and women that work very hard, but they get a lot of good information also. And the only reason I talk about Frank's cooperation is when the movie came out, he kept saying that the agents were corrupt and they stole his money, which never happened because we asked him about that. And we would have investigated that if that would have happened. And so, you know, he had a responsibility not to basically embellish where, you know, he's dragging the agency down when it wasn't necessary. He was able to create a story to go live his life. But a very major drug dealer, not as charismatic, no way in the world like Denzel Washington. And what he was selling was poison. I mean, he killed a generation. You know, when you think about the '70s and this guy, they were big in Harlem. Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes. There was no reason. There was no reason to go to Harlem except to buy heroin. You know, there was no retail. There was no restaurants. There was no entertainment. Altogether different now. You go up there in 2023, there's retail, there's entertainment, there's a new hotel being built. It's a vibrant metropolis on 125th Street. But back then it was Heroin Central #1. And that's all it was. It was like the Night of the Living Dead. You'd see people with the abscess in their arms, walking around trying to get warm in the wintertime. It was just a tough place to be. And then it's that backdrop that DEA was formed that said, hey, let's take back these American cities one by one.
Thank you, Lou. Very nice. Jim, there's two stories I want you to talk about. And the first one to me is, it's, you know, selling drugs, no matter what, is bad. But you dealt with a group in Southern California, the Coronado case, that is very different from a lot of these other cases. There was not a lot of violence, if any, involved. Can you talk about the origins of that Coronado company and what they were doing and how you guys took them down?
Yes. Well, I also came on the job in New York in 1971. But in 1974, I made the escape and got transferred to San Diego. After being there about 5 or 6 years, well, first off, let me give you the history of the Coronado Company. The Coronado Company was actually a group of high school students. They were Coronado High School swim team. And of course, we're right next to the Mexican border. And if anybody's familiar with Coronado, there's a isthmus, I guess it is, that attaches to the mainland called the Silver Strand. And so these guys decided that they were going to start swimming to Mexico and bringing back marijuana. And they would swim down to Mexico and bring back 5 or 10 kilos in a waterproof sack that they had built. And they started doing this daily. And then pretty soon, all nights. And they graduated from swimming loads to surfboards. Eventually, they went to Zodiac boats. Because the SEAL team is there. They saw the SEAL team with their Zodiac boats, so they started running boats down to Zodiac boats down to Mexico, bringing back loads. Now they're up to maybe 100 kilos at a time. They were dealing with a Mexican trafficker that they were having a hard time with. So, because none of them spoke Spanish. So they went to their Spanish teacher at high school, Luis Henry Villar, a Cuban, educated in New York, and was their Spanish teacher. And they induced him for $100 to go to Mexico and talk to this trafficker. Well, Lou Villar was a smart guy, and eventually he ended up talking to a guy named Roberto Beltran, who was a major trafficker in the Tijuana area in those days. And they started moving upward. And we're making a lot of money. But about that time, the Coronado PD set up on the beach, the Silver Strand, and they arrested these guys. The guys that were on the boats. The bosses of the Coronado Company, now Lou Villar, a guy named Eddie Otero, and a guy named Bob Lahadny, weren't present. But one of the guys rolled over, they got indicted, and they all fugitated. Now, in those days, we're talking about 70, 77, it was very easy to become a fugitive. All you had to do is get a fake driver's license and in a different name, put your picture on it, and nobody could find you because there were no computers in those days. So they all disappeared. I came about on that case. I got assigned that case when I transferred to the Narcotics Task Force. There was no information on these guys. Nobody had any idea where they went. And in those days, when you went to a new group, you'd get a stack like this of fugitive cases because there were just lots of fugitives. So one day, a assigned cop from the Coronado PD called me and he said, "Hey Jim," he said, "you got that Coronado Company case, don't you?" He said, we arrested a guy last night, small amount of coke, and he has information about Eddie Otero, one of the heads. So I go talk to him, and he says, I know where Eddie Otero lives, up in Santa Barbara. So I said, okay, got him out of jail, hopped in my car, we drove up to Santa Barbara. And he said, I don't know where the address, but I know I could find the house. So sure enough, we found the house. It's in Montecito, which is a nicer area outside of Santa Barbara. But unfortunately, the house was empty. So I checked around, got the postal inspectors involved, and they said he was living there under the name Ed Morgan, but his mail is being forwarded to a girl named Bambi Merriweather. And I thought, well, that's a weird name, you know? So get back to DEA. We have a computer system called NATIS, Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs Information Systems. And I get on there and I run the name, Bambi Merriweather, and boom, I get a hit. And it's out of Norfolk, Virginia. And what happened is, in talking to the Norfolk office, this guy had walked in and given up a guy he knew was J.R. Richards. And he said, J.R. Richards, one of the wealthiest guys he's ever known. This guy was he installed hardwood floors, teakwood floors. And this guy wanted a teakwood floor in his house in Hilton Head, North Carolina. Is that North Carolina or South Carolina? South Carolina. So I got talking to him, and I said, and he said he was a Thai marijuana smuggler. So we flew the guy to San Diego, and we debriefed him. And we found out that he had basically traveled with this Lou Villar under the name J.R. Richards. He has 4 different houses throughout the United States. And he had been to all his houses, done work on them. He'd been to all of his associates' houses, did construction work on them, and had met his attorney, had met his accountant, all the heads of this organization. Had a picture book of all these people, and he identified all the heads of the Coronado Company. So, and he also said, you know, these guys have lots of money. So we decided to do something different than DEA would normally do. Because they're fugitives, you're supposed to go out and arrest them right off the bat. But DEA had recently, or the government had recently passed a seizure law to be able to seize assets. And we quickly learned the way to really hurt these guys, because these guys would have gotten maybe 2 years on this old marijuana case. The way to hurt them is to take away their toys. And these guys had lots of toys. So we started doing a financial case. We had a newly formed group in San Diego called the Asset Removal Team, and we teamed up with those guys. A couple were IRS agents, customs agents, and we started looking for all their assets. We identified their accountant. His name was Andy Willis, and he is the guy that had established all their, had arranged financing of all the houses and property they owned. So you've heard these guys talk about these sexy undercover assignments. They were France and Mexico and all around the country. These great assignments. I went undercover as a garbage man. So every Friday morning, I would put on my worst of clothes and go down to the local trash company, and one of the supervisors drove the trash truck, and I'd stand in the back of it. And we would go to Andy Willis's place and pick up his trash. Unfortunately, half the time, he did not bring the trash out on time when we were there. So we'd have to drive the neighborhood picking up everybody else's trash. And I can tell you, those trash cans were heavy. Eventually, but we got a pot of gold in every one, because he never shredded anything. So we got all the documents that led us to the property of the organization, the cars that they owned, the way that they laundered their money, which was Andy Willis had gone to Hong Kong and he set up corporations over there. One was called the Mo-Ching Trading Company, a variety of different names. And then they would take their money over to Hong Kong, and then they would transfer it back and purchase the real estate and investments. They were buying diamonds. So they bought a lot of diamonds as investment. So we basically sat on these guys for probably 6 months, and we had to work up a seizure asset on every one of their cars, every one of their houses, every boat. One guy had a string of polo ponies. They were playing polo. These are top crust people in Santa Barbara. And finally, on November the 5th, we hit the bunch. And we arrested Villar and Otero and the Hodney. They're all driving, at that time, the hottest car going was a Mercedes 450 SEL 6.9. They all had those. We got 3 of those, and 18 more cars. We arrested them all, took them back there, and about that time, one of the other members, who was your operations manager, called me on the phone and wanted to cooperate. So he came in, and he gave up probably 100 more people. So we indicted that. We ended up indicting about 3 or 4 different levels of people. We got their attorney, we got their accountant, and we got all the members of this organization. We used to call marijuana kitty dope in DEA, but it is really the biggest financial gain for drug traffickers. There is a big market here in America, as you can tell, those of you who live in Nevada. In those days, it was tie sticks they were bringing in. Tie sticks are the flowering female plant. They wrap it around a piece of bamboo with monofilament line, and they would sell this stuff for $1,650 a pound back in 1980s, late 70s, early 80s. So if you brought in 10 tons of Thai marijuana, you were making $32 million. And they were bringing in that kind of a load once or twice a year. So it's a big money thing. We made, it was the first big financial case we had made on the West Coast. And within the next few years, DEA was seizing more money every year than its budget was.
Wow.
So and it was really a great case for DEA, I think.
Thank you, Jim. You know, if You told the story extremely well. I will say that if you are interested in to know more about this case, you just Google Coronado Company, and this article will come up. It's long. It's probably 20,000 words, but it goes into greater detail about this than we could possibly get tonight. This was a very sophisticated group in its day. They're using the latest technology. They're coordinating things like with military precision, until, they got fat and sassy, I think, and that's when they got.
Yeah, they ran it. They called themselves the Coronado Company, and they ran it as a business. And they were all smart kids. No longer kids by the time they got arrested. But they were smart, and they had a need-to-know basis. So only the top guys knew everybody. Other people were only told what they needed to know. They could have run Ford Motor Company had they put their mind to it.
Yeah. Well, Doug, it brings us to you. I want to, as with everybody here, we could talk for 2 hours just with Doug about his experiences, but I think we should start just with and just to sort of span the globe a little further. You spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but in particular Afghanistan, where so much of this opium, was produced. What was your role over there, and what happened when you were there?
Okay, I'd like to, I think the audience might be interested in this. I'd like to make one comment before I start down that path.
Sure.
We've heard a lot about the ladies that have joined DEA and all this. Keep in mind, because women all know how they've been shut down and unable for many decades and years to do certain things. But I joined the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs in 1970. At that time, there was no females, they weren't allowed. There were no females in federal law enforcement in any agency in the United States government, okay? In 1972, the Federal Bureau of Investigation hired the first 2 females. That was it. And then the gates started opening after that. DEA came in soon afterwards. Patty came in a little later than that. In fact, one of the first female agents hired by the FBI was a former nun, so go figure that. But the women have made huge contributions. It's not a surprise to you ladies in the audience here, obviously, but to the drug enforcement business, and we're proud to have them as partners in the Drug Enforcement Administration, I can tell you that. All right, so DEA, Afghanistan. All right. I'm the only guy that you're going to see up here in this panel that was a farm kid, all right? All these other guys are city guys from New York and whatever else type stuff. So I'm a farmer, and I go from the wheat fields of Missouri, cornfields of Missouri, to my first foreign posting in 1971. That was Detroit, Michigan, okay? And it was pretty damn foreign, I got to tell you. But anyway, after being there for about 7 years, I volunteered to go overseas. They didn't get selected, and then one day I get called and said, "Hey, guess what? You're going to Afghanistan." I'm like, "I didn't put in for Afghanistan." "Yeah, you did 2 years ago. Don't you remember you put in?" I said, "Well, yeah, but I didn't get the job." Well, guess what? The guy that got the job got over there and said, "I ain't staying here," and left. So now you're going. So anyway, I go to Afghanistan as the number 2 agent in 1978, a 2-man office in Afghanistan. And our job there was to gather intelligence. It was beginning to be an opium center, if you will. At that time, you still had Southeast Asia, Kunsa and Burma, and that were the big opium producers at that point in time. But anyway, so I'm working there doing this, and then, lo and behold, the Russians backed a group of Afghans who deposed the government, killed the president and his family, and all that kind of stuff. And so they reduced the office from 2 people to 1 person. So I'm the new guy there. I'm there in Afghanistan, doing stuff with the Afghans on intelligence and training and doing this type of things, and just kind of figuring out what's going on. Worst day of my life. Not many people in this room could probably identify the worst day. I know the worst day of my life. But the worst day of my life was February 14th, 1979. I got a call from the embassy as I was leaving my house to go to work, saying, no, don't come to the embassy, go to the Kabul hotel. The U.S. ambassador's been kidnapped, and he's being held there. We got some people there, but we want a law enforcement guy there too. So I go to the Kabul hotel, a guy named Adolph Dubs. He never went by the name Adolph.
Spike, right?
He went by Spike. Spike Dubs, great guy. He was the ambassador, and he was being held in room 117 there with 3 kidnappers that had him and stuff. So to make a long story short, at that time you had Russian advisors in Afghanistan trying to support the current government that had deposed the other president, duly elected, so to speak. And so you had Russian advisors there, and you had KGB. KGB shows up at the scene of the kidnapping, where we are, not the kidnapping, but where the ambassador is being held. And before too much time had gone, they wanted this situation over with. They brought in some Afghan guys to kick the door in to rescue the ambassador. Everybody in the room was killed, including the ambassador, and that was the last ambassador killed until Benghazi a few years ago. We've all heard about that, I guess. But so that was my first stint in Afghanistan. At that point, shortly after that, the Russians invaded Afghanistan. I was kicked out, and everybody left pretty much. The embassy was closed. Fast forward 2000, after 9/11, the U.S. went into Afghanistan shortly after to go after the perpetrators of that. And within about 2 years of that, the U.S. government decided they wanted to step up the drug business. I was asked to go back to Afghanistan to be the director of the Kabul Counter-Narcotic Task Force, responsible for oversight, integration, coordination of U.S. government drug programs. So I did that and was there for several years and until I eventually retired from DEA. Then I stayed over there and did some work to support the U.S. military with some special operations they were doing. So that was Afghanistan.
And maybe we'll wrap it up with this one, because we do want to get to our next Act 3 of our program. Doug, you were involved in, a lot of this revolves around, especially 90s forward, this kingpin strategy, this strategy of how you're going to go about taking down drug lords, as we call them in our title. You were involved in I think the formulation of that and the execution of that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, kingpin strategy was the idea and the concept of, I guess, I think the 5th administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration, a guy named Judge Robert C. Bonner, who had been U.S. Attorney in Los Angeles, then later became a federal judge in Los Angeles, came in, very, very smart guy, a bright guy, and he is the gentleman that put together the idea that, all right, going after these drug organizations, we need to identify the complete organization, where the drugs are grown, where they are manufactured or turned into heroin, the distribution networks, the methods of shipping, the money laundering, all this. Go after all aspects and all of the major players in each deal. Don't just focus on the top guys. So the kingpin strategy was, basically to completely identify an organization and attack all the various components of it instead of just going after one guy or whatever. And so that's started in the early 90s and it's continued in various forms even to this day. So that's due to DEA. Actually, I would say Administrator Bonner was the one who brought that up.
And I think just to clarify one thing on that, I think there's been criticism of this reference to the kingpin strategy, like you capture the kingpin and somehow the whole thing is going to fall apart. But what actually happens is that this another person steps up. But that's what you're describing. It sounds like kingpin strategy is kind of a bad name for it.
That could be, yeah. That probably does lead to what you're saying, thinking that going after just the top guy. But no, it's going after the entire organization, targeting the various major components of the organization. Yes.
Very good. Well, I think we're gonna end Act 2 there, and I'll let Shakayla come up. Thank you.
All right, we're going to get started. Thank you, thank you. All right, Jeff, now we know who the party animals are in the group. I like it. So we wanted to bring this full circle. This will be much shorter. But after everything you heard, we thought it was important to kind of bring this discussion, as I just said, full circle, and just to talk about the present day and the future as well. So it really is an honor to welcome William Bill Bodner to the museum. He is a 31-year veteran of the Drug Enforcement Administration. He assumed the role of Special Agent in charge of the Drug Enforcement Administration Los Angeles Field Division in June 2019. Now, as the Special Agent in charge, Mr. Bodner is responsible for overseeing the daily operations of 14 offices located in Nevada, Hawaii, Guam, and the 7 Southern California counties, which make up the greater Los Angeles area. Please welcome Mr. Bodner.
Thank you.
So my first question for you, after hearing all of these, just harrowing stories that came before you, why the DEA for you?
Great question. When I was graduating college, I found myself needing to find something to do with my life, and a 9-to-5 job just didn't seem like the thing. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I wasn't the kind of person who was going to go in an office and sit behind a desk all day. And the other component to it was I wanted something that had some positive impact on society. That was important to me as a, whatever I was, 22-year-old or 23-year-old at that time. And DEA was in the news. This was in, the 1990, well, I guess it was when I first looked at joining DEA. There was a lot in the news. Cocaine was huge, the cocaine cowboys. It was the thing to do. It sounded like an exciting job. Hey, Miami Vice was the TV show. Like, who doesn't want to drive a Ferrari, drive a speedboat, and wear no socks every day? So no, the reality is it just sounded like a super exciting job and something that I would have fun doing, but had a positive impact on society.
Right. How have the past few years since, assuming office back in 2019 been for you?
It's been rough. The reality is, the changes that we've seen in drug trafficking over my 31 years have really accelerated just in the past couple of years. And, it's to the point now where we're losing over 106,000, 107,000 Americans every year to drug-caused deaths. And just to put that in perspective, I think gun violence accounts for 42, maybe 45,000 deaths in this country. We need to address that. We need to have policies that address that. And we need to support the men and women at DEA who are out there every single day addressing that issue. And Mr. Rice said it the best when he said DEA's mission, well, he didn't say DEA's mission, but he said, hey, our men and women are out there every day trying to keep Americans safe. And the reality is that is DEA's mission. DEA's mission is not necessarily to arrest people. It's to keep Americans safe from the harms of drugs. One of the strategies that we use, and we're proud to use it, is arresting people. But an analogy would be if I told you all, hey, the Nevada Highway Patrol, their mission is to write speeding tickets. How much value do you all see in that? Or even me as a cop, do I see in that? But if I tell you the mission of the Nevada Highway Patrol is to keep your kids safe on the freeway, and guess what? They're going to write some speeding tickets to do that, and they're going to go after the worst speeders and the people that are putting your children most at risk. Then all of a sudden you say, oh, wait, I'm behind that. That's what DEA is doing in the drug world now. We're really trying to keep the children of our country safe who are now bearing a brunt of the harm that we're seeing every day.
You mentioned one strategy. Are there any other successful strategies that have been employed by the DEA to reduce drug trafficking?
So let me talk about one that's new, somewhat new. It's the way we look at the traditional term is overdose death. Now we call it a drug poisoning, and there's a very specific reason for that. But we will take a case where someone dies of a drug poisoning, trace the drugs back to the dealer who sold those drugs, even if it was one pill or a 1 gram of a drug, if that's the dose that killed that person, it's a 20-year federal charge. And in our society today, there's a lot of people who struggle, let me put it this way, that struggle with incarceration as a viable tool to help address this problem. Let me say this, and these cases happen every day. I'm just going to talk about this one because it's been adjudicated and I'm allowed to talk about it. But there was a case in Pasadena, California in September 2020. One dealer caused 7 poisonings or overdoses in 1 weekend and 3 deaths. That's one dealer. We all heard of the West Point cadets in 21, I think it was, or 22, that were on spring break in Florida, and 5 of them, I think, overdosed. There was 4 famous comedians in Los Angeles, 4 overdosed, 3 dead one night. The dealers that caused those incidents, what happens the next weekend? If DEA is not there to file those cases, what happens the next weekend? Because state law doesn't really allow right now for the charging of these individuals. They would have to be charged with murder, and that's a completely different case to prove. That's the part of our strategy now that's a little bit different. We're going after drug trafficking where it's causing the harm, and that is people selling drugs to children over social media and things like that.
You talk a lot about just how many people have been affected. I'm sure anyone in this room may, have a family member or know someone who may be affected by drugs. It's become a very personal issue over the past few years. What are some of the setbacks or challenges that have happened that has made this so difficult to combat?
I think one thing that's made it more difficult, and it really started in the pandemic, was a digitization or a move online of a lot of retail drug trafficking. Think of how all of our jobs changed in March 2020. A lot more remote work, people teleworking. So what was closed down? What was closed down here in Las Vegas? How did things change? The places where people would normally socialize and do drug transactions, they disappeared. Drug dealers didn't just pack up shop. They said, where are we going to go to sell drugs? The answer was where the people were going, social media. When people couldn't socialize in person, especially young people or teenagers, there was an exponential growth in social media platforms, and drug dealers were right there, and they realized it's effective. They can do delivery like Uber Eats or DoorDash. They can take payment by payment apps like Zelle. And when things opened up again after the pandemic, it continued. So right now, there's an amount of anonymity that social media platforms, quite frankly, allow, right? And that makes it more difficult for us to do some cases. But at the same time, DEA agents are very innovative. From 1973 to today, we figure out ways to get people out from behind the computer, get them into the streets, identify them, and bring charges on them.
Can you shed light on the DEA's collaboration with some of your international partners and agencies to combat that, transnational?
Sure. So issue? I think right now we have about 93 foreign offices in, let's say, 65, 69 countries around the world. That's a tremendous international footprint, probably bigger now than any other federal law enforcement agency. Back when 9/11 happened, the intel community actually, as they discussed what was happening with terrorism in the world, they realized that DEA had actually the best network of human sources around the world. And we were actually invited into the intel community at that time. So how do our offices, our foreign offices, work? I kind of categorize it in 3 different groups. There's offices where we have people overseas, and we are addressing organizations in those countries that are harming Americans here in the United States. And I would put, say, Mexico in that particular basket. We have agents in Mexico. They're working Mexican cartels right now who are dominating the international drug trade. That's one of the most significant changes that I've seen in my 30 years is when I started, it was really Colombian cartels, cocaine, and we've moved away from that now, and Mexican cartels have really taken over. But our agents there are working the threat with the counterparts, and that threat is causing harm to Americans. Then there's where we have offices, let's say in Europe, or Asia is probably a better example right now, offices in Asia where Mexican cartels will be shipping drugs to Asia. We're going to have agents in Asia that work that drug problem, because if we can dismantle those organizations, we're actually protecting Americans, because they're also sending drugs here. And then finally, the third basket, I would say, is, and right now we're trying to rethink this, it's probably foreign offices where we're working and building capabilities in a foreign country to help them deal with their drug problem that doesn't necessarily have an effect on us here in the United States right now. Why would we do that? Because trends are always changing, trafficking is always changing, and that presence that we're building today in that country 5 years from now may be crucial to address an emerging threat or something new that's on the horizon.
Are there any new organized crime groups that are on the DEA's radar? I know that you talked about Mexico, but are there any other ones?
It's really the Jalisco cartel and the Sinaloa cartel, which is predominantly Mayo Zambada and some sons of Chapo Guzman, the Chapitos. Really, those are the organizations now that are driving drug trafficking throughout the world. And what has made them incredibly wealthy and powerful now is this transition from, what did we hear about today? We heard about marijuana, Thai stick marijuana, cocaine, a lot about heroin. Those drugs are what I call organic drugs, not like USDA certified organic, but reality is drugs that rely on what? Mother Nature, right? They rely on Mother Nature. So in order to make those drugs, what do you need? You need a climate in South America where you can grow the coca plant. And you need to protect that particular region. So you're going to need gunmen there, and you're going to need to have some kind of political influence just to control that region where those coca plants grow so you can refine it and make the drug. Heroin, same thing. Poppy plant, you need to have fields in a specific climate. You need to control that territory. You need to keep other drug trafficking organizations from taking over that territory. And it's labor intensive. You're having people in the field, scoring the poppies, scraping the gum. The Mexican cartels, and that's not even talking about marijuana, which the Mexican cartels are really pretty much out of the marijuana business now, for the most part. The cartels realized, hey, if we want to make money, if we want to scale our operation, if we really want to be huge, we can't rely on Mother Nature. We can't buy cocaine from Colombia, have to ship it through the transit zone in Central America where there's 8 different governments, radar planes, the United States Coast Guard. That's not going to work. In order to scale that, it's too risky. We're just buying a product from someone else, we're tacking on our margin, and we're selling it to the United States. That's out. Heroin, how do you scale that? There's not that much good territory where you can grow the poppies, and you're going to be battling other groups constantly for control of that. Synthetic drugs, methamphetamine and fentanyl. All you need is chemicals. You can have a synthesis lab in a garage. You can move it from one part of Mexico to another if you need to, if law enforcement's after you. And the profit is literally limitless if you can keep the chemicals coming. And that's what we've seen over the past 7-8 years, and it is an explosion of synthetic drugs. Fentanyl, the one that we hear about every day because it's killing people, and especially our young people. But the reality is methamphetamine is doing just as much damage to Americans. It's just that it's not killing them today. It's giving them mental health issues. It's making them live on the street. It's causing a lot of the other social issues that all of us see, but we probably don't connect to methamphetamine as easily as when we see a dead body, we connect it to fentanyl.
That's a really good point. And that's a topic that we've discussed a lot here at the Mob Museum, is just the impact of synthetic drugs on our communities. And so if you could elaborate more on that, what is being done to try and combat synthetic drugs specifically?
I think that goes to strategy, I guess, a little bit. One of the things that we're really pushing hard on now is cutting off the precursor chemicals from China going into Mexico. It's challenging. A lot of them are dual-use chemicals, meaning they do have some legal uses. So it can be challenging and takes, takes a time-consuming investigation, which we're not afraid of doing. That's probably the main thing. The smuggling routes, like I tell people, they say, hey, how long did it take DEA or did DEA react, how long did it take DEA to react to fentanyl? And I said it was instantaneous. And they said, how can that be? What do you mean it was instantaneous? It's the same organizations. We were already investigating that cartel, those people, those smuggling routes, those stash houses. It's the same organizations, it's just a different drug. So a lot of the game is the same, it's just now there's no room for error because the drugs are so deadly and so powerful, it's very unforgiving. I think that's really the majority of it.
Yeah. On the topic of marijuana, has the legalization of marijuana in several states across the country affected your operations and your priorities in any way?
It definitely has. I mean, it's for sure changed our priorities. It's not a priority for us now. And as a leader, when you're doing a search warrant and you're kicking in a door, the type of drug doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with the danger of what you're going to encounter on the other side of that door. So if you're going to put your people at risk, there better be a prosecution that comes out of it, and there better be someone going to jail. And the issues with marijuana now are a bit disjointed between state and federal law. I mean, I would argue actually that if the law is not being enforced, it's more or less legal already. What we've done is just prioritize fentanyl, methamphetamine, right? Synthetic drugs being produced by the cartels in Mexico, and kind of left it to the states with their individual laws to determine what resources they want to apply to that issue. I have heard, interestingly though, because we talked about marijuana coming out of Thailand now, guess what Thailand is complaining about now? Marijuana coming from California going into Thailand.
And I want to end the conversation with just a look ahead. Going into the next few years in your position, what are some of the challenges and the priorities that you foresee at the DEA?
I think one thing is understanding who is at risk now. I think it's important for DEA to make sure the public understands who at risk. It used to be, back in like Javier's time or Lou Rice's time, in fact, in New York in 1991, there was something called Tango and Cash heroin. I don't know if any of the New York people remember Tango and Cash heroin. Guess what? It was fentanyl. It was fentanyl mixed with heroin. So that was 31 years ago, 32 years ago. And here's the key thing. Dozens of people died. Not thousands of people. Dozens of people died, and it was horrific. And it was a huge thing in New York, and there were literally cars going up and down the street saying, don't use the Tango and Cash heroin. And there was news stories about it and everything else. What was the purpose of all that? Awareness. Let people, at least give people the information about the drug they're taking so they can make a better decision about it. And I hate to say that as a society, that's where we're at, but that's where we're at. Right now with fentanyl, or to get back to what I was saying, it used to be we knew who was at risk of a drug-caused death or an overdose, right? It was a hype, an addict. It was someone who was a heroin addict. They were at risk of dying of a drug overdose. Today, and that group of people is still at risk today, don't get me wrong. And we're losing a ton of them, and I know we got to get those people into treatment, et cetera. But there's also two other groups now that are in danger. Experimental drug users. Who are those people? Those people are our teenagers who experimented with drugs when they were young, who experimented with something when in my generation, when we were young, et cetera. But now it's fake prescription pills, right? And kids, self-medication is one of the #1 things. Like I talk to a lot of parents who lose 14-year-olds through 17-year-olds, and it was a kid who had some kind of anxiety going on or something, thought they were going to get a Xanax pill because they heard it would help them. They bought it on social media. It turned out to be fake. It was fentanyl, and it killed them. And these pills look identical to pharmaceutical drugs now. If there was a fake cancer drug that was killing our children in the United States, whatever we would do about that is what we should be doing now about these fake prescription pills. Then there's the recreational drug users. They were maybe at risk 20 years ago. Now, when we see an overdose cluster, like all those cases where I talked about where 5 people overdose, 7 people overdose, 4 people overdose, that's generally when cocaine is mistaken for fentanyl, or actually fentanyl is mistaken for cocaine, or fentanyl is mixed with cocaine. And one of the, not funny, one of the inquisitive questions I get asked a lot is, hey, why would somebody mix cocaine with fentanyl? That's a speedball. That's a drug cocktail that's been around for 80 years in this country in one form or another. And the premise is you're going to have the positive effects of an opiate offset the negative effects of the stimulant and vice versa, and you're going to have a perfect high. Unfortunately, with fentanyl, it's so strong, it's killing people, and it's killing groups of people because they're using it together. Then, real quick on the mistaken part, when these drugs cross the border, as I said earlier, it's the same organizations moving cocaine, moving fentanyl, moving meth. Fentanyl and cocaine are packaged very similarly. They're in kilo bricks, wrapped the same way. They're a white powder, and I've had people say, well, you know, fentanyl's actually a little bit of a different color than cocaine. It is, but the fentanyl that's crossing the border is about 15% pure, and the other 85% is the same cutting agents that are generally used in cocaine. So it's gonna look very similar to cocaine. So it comes up, crosses the border, it comes right up to LA, it's getting ready to be sent to Las Vegas, and they give instructions to a guy, hey, take 3 kilos of cocaine and give it to this guy. And he pulls 3 kilos of fentanyl and gives it to that guy. Now, if you're expecting fentanyl and you get cocaine, you're gonna be pissed off. If you're expecting cocaine and you get fentanyl, you are 100% going to be dead because the dosage you're going to use is enough to kill multiple people. So I think that's a big part of it, is educating the public on who's at risk now. It's not just the, you know, I know parents are out there saying this now, saying, hey, my kid's, you know, not a drug addict, so he or she's not gonna die. It's not about that now. It could be someone using drugs for the first time because they don't know what they're taking.
Thank you, Special Agent Bodner,
Sure thing.
and thank you all for joining us for tonight's presentation. Just a quick note that there will be a book signing with some of our panelists in the courtroom waiting area if you are interested, and we certainly hope that this was an informative and insightful presentation for everyone. Thank you.